the world is becoming more protectionist, as we can see. In preparation for this podcast, I researched, it was online, a UK law firm, Gowling WLG, in 2017, November, published a study on this. And this is pretty obvious stuff, but they put the numbers to it. They said since 2009, the world has implemented more than 7,000 measures believed to be injurious to global trade. The US has passed 1,300 pieces of legislation way before Trump came into office even. But the biggest sort of proponents of protectionism were Argentina and India.
Interesting.
With Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, bucking the trend by being the most open, most porous in terms of their, and certainly Saudi Arabia need to innovate because they can't rely on oil for the rest of their lives. You see the IPO of Saudi Aramco to get the cash in to develop, right?
Yes.
But from your experience, how has protectionism affected your line of work?
Listen,
and how would you define that?
Protectionism is there, and it's undoubted. And to me, it's a much bigger conversation, right? So we need to look into history, and that's why I get very concerned with the current times, and not just within trade finance or even banking. I remember when the Lehman Brothers crisis happened, I started reading a book about the Great Depression and everything that happened following the Great Depression. And if you think about it, we may be going in repeat mode.
In a cycle.
As we speak, yes. Yeah. And that's the concerning part, because we all know that the Great Depression ended up in people beating themselves up badly in the Second World War. But if you look at it, it was a big financial crisis. And what's the tendency you have in when things go wrong? I'm not talking about you, Klisman, or me, but I'm talking about...
As a society.
Yeah, society. We tend to point fingers out, right? It's not my fault. It's that guy is stealing my job.
You start to act out.
So it's and then you have right wing or extreme left wing coming into power, and it polarizes society, right? So society starts living on the back of fear rather than possibility. So, like him or not, I'm not a big fan, to be honest, but you have the rise of Donald Trump in the US. But it's not so much the figurehead Donald Trump.
It's a movement behind him.
Exactly. Hope it doesn't listen to the podcast, because otherwise we're doomed. We're going to be on his Twitter feed, etc., etc. But it's an interesting movement, which is fed by fear. Then you have Brexit, with its merits and weak points, but the impact it had was direct impact was to increase anxiety against foreigners and just creating scapegoatism and so on and so forth, and creating isolationism, and so on and so forth. And you look at the rise of nearly racist movements across continental Europe. It goes around and round and round.
But in terms of trade, I think from what I've seen, the only two active responses of this right wing or this extreme movement has been sort of what Trump is doing with China and also Brexit. I mean, there's been a rise of the far right throughout Europe, but I haven't seen any actionable, trade policies from these guys.
I think we need to look outside the US and Europe and Britain and China and so on and so forth, because the biggest lesson at the minute is coming from Africa. Africa, led by His Excellency President Paul Kagame from Rwanda, and a very, very, very good new generation of politicians across the continent, still with the notable exceptions, but the overwhelmingly much better than it was in the past. And under the leadership of Paul Kagame and the African Union, they are now establishing the Intra-Africa Free Trade Agreement, of which I believe nearly 100% of African states have signed up for. And of course, they're in the process of ratifying and so on. And if memory doesn't fail me, from July onwards, this largest free trade area since the creation of WTO is coming into force on the back of policies that are completely contrarian to what the United States and the UK to a certain extent, and continental Europe and so on, are undertaking through that polarization. Africa is finally coming together, and I do believe that this creates massive opportunities. Your second question, if I recall correctly, was on whether this has a lag effect.
This protectionism, does it affect trade straight away, or what are the resulting trade implications specifically?
Listen, I'll be very honest with you. I'm very emerging markets focused, right? So I can give you the emerging markets outlook. And remember Belt and Road.
Yeah.
So that dominates, right? So that's outside. It's not outside the sphere of influence of the United States or Europe, but the Chinese were, as they normally are, extremely intelligent in the way that they reignited their trade routes, or they're on the verge of reigniting their trade routes, very much outside of their geographical boundaries and restrictions. And that was just genius, because how did they do it? China developed for many years on the back of internal consumption, and of course creating a market for their exports. But very quickly they realized that for them to continue moving the machine, they needed, number one, commodities that were very scarce for them and that were abundant in places like Africa. But they needed to keep their companies, especially state-owned companies, going. So it's very simple. The boats were going into Africa to pick up the commodities, and they thought, well, what the heck? I mean, these guys need to be brought up in their development stage. So why don't we offer our companies our financing to make that happen? And eventually, the Belt and Road was born, and they are now not only significantly expanding their area of influence, but they're also profiting a lot in terms of how it's executed. Quite a few states, if not all of them, in Africa have contracted Chinese yuan-denominated debt with China from Chinese banks and from the Chinese state, that is then used to pay Chinese companies to go and develop projects in infrastructure projects in these places, which will then benefit Chinese exports tremendously. Right. So it's genius. I mean, of course, Trump is uneasy with the whole thing, and we mustn't forget geography here, because war and peace is all about geographical expansion and contraction, and what is happening in effect is a geographical expansion from China. So of course Mr. Trump and his administration, and even if it wasn't Mr. Trump, someone else would be uneasy with this whole thing, because it creates a threat to America's dominance in world trade.
Well, you see also that the BNI, Belt and Road Initiative, was announced, I think, 2009, right after the crash of the West. So I think that was strategic, opportunistic, but very sensible of them to go into it when the world in the West was burning.
Yes. So
they came with an alternative view of what your life could look like, or what your trade routes can look like if you work with us. And they can play the long game. They don't have, the political structures we have that pivot every 4 to 5 years.
Quite right.
And especially when we have a president that comes in who has such forceful views, it pivots to a very high degree. And then the rest of the world needs to either catch up, align, or now we see a disalignment in Europe, and that leaves the UK being independent from EU now, needing to form their own response to this.
Exactly.
Because the EU have been consistent all along. Perhaps they've been conservative. They haven't really spoken out too much in terms of foreign policy or their trade, because it's worked for them to an extent. You can debate that.
They've got too many consensus to forge.
27,
That's it, to become influential. I mean, we're doing a little bit of lobbying work now within the ITFA in terms of the capital rules and the insurance product. And we're learning a lot about how the European Union works in terms of their own decision making. And it's a very, very interesting machine in terms of generating consensus or even majorities. It's difficult to see. Although the European Union has so much potential, it's difficult to see how it can materialize that potential on the back of the red tape that it fosters sometimes.